When Rick saw a nun standing by herself on a dark, lonely road, he was skeptical about giving her a ride because the road was infamous. But Rick gave in to his kind nature. When the ride was over, the nun expressed her gratitude in a way that Rick did not expect. You won't believe how she thanked him. Rick became a truck driver out of necessity. He had grown up in a home where he lacked parents' love, care, and guidance. His father would constantly hit him, and his mom never found the courage to stand up for him. Rick was in high school when he decided he couldn't take it any longer, so he ran away from home. While hitchhiking his way across the country, Rick encountered an old trucker who immediately sensed that he was troubled. When asked what the problem was, Rick opened up to him and shared his story. Touched by the young man's story, the man decided to help, so he brought Rick into his home where he raised him as if he were family. When Rick turned 28, his foster father advised him that it was time to get a more stable job. Until then, he had been helping the old man with various errands. Now it was time for him to start looking into different opportunities and finding one that suited him best. With a recommendation from his foster father, Rick got his first truck driving job and started his career as a driver. A year later, Rick got married to a beautiful woman, Selma, and she got pregnant a few months after the wedding. The couple didn't realize they were having quadruplets until it was almost too late. This led to health complications that made Selma unable to work, so she became a stay-at-home wife and helped Rick in every way that she could. In due time, Selma gave birth to a set of healthy quadruplets, 3 boys and a girl. With the arrival of the kids, Rick, who didn't want to be irresponsible like his dad, increased his shifts on the road. His determination to keep his family well cared for drove him to keep looking for extra gigs. Along with a friend, he soon secured a job that paid him more than his usual rate to transport produce. His goal was to use the money he would get from the job to buy his own truck, so he wouldn't have to pay 40% of his earnings to the leaser. Moreover, with the additional income, he would be able to meet all of his family's needs and wants. Sounds like a good plan, right? Unfortunately, things wouldn't go as planned. In an effort to maximize their earnings and transport more goods, Rick and his friend decided to reduce the amount of time they spent sleeping and resting. This proved beneficial from a financial point of view, as it allowed them to be paid for every hour that they drove. They also didn't have to spend money staying overnight at motels, but one night something tragic happened. That night, while Rick was behind the wheel driving to their next delivery stop, they were involved in a ghastly accident. Unfortunately, Rick had dozed off for a few seconds and only woke up when another truck collided with them. The impact of the crash knocked Rick out instantly, but his friend did not survive. The process of recovery was a long and arduous one, which led to Rick losing his life savings and his earnings. His family, who had been living comfortably before, was plunged into penury. Rick was a tenacious man, and because of that, it didn't take long for him to get back on the road. Sadly, he would have to work for a few more years before he could afford to buy his own truck. It was on his first trip after his accident that something unexpected happened. Rick was driving solo and needed a place to stop for the night before he became too exhausted. Unable to afford a motel, he decided to park on the side of the road and sleep there instead. To get to the next rest stop, he had to pass through a dark and lonely road. Just as he was about to make a turn back onto the highway, he noticed a nun standing alone by the side of the road. The nun held her hand out asking for a lift. Rick contemplated leaving her right there on the road. He had heard several stories of truck drivers being robbed on the road, and he didn't want to be one of them. The only money he had was his earnings from his last delivery, and it was meant for his family. He was about to drive away, but then he noticed the nun's exhausted and frightened expression. This caused him to pause and reconsider his decision. "Where are you headed?" he asked after rolling down the window. "Just until you get to the shack," she replied, and he signaled her to get into the truck. The nun climbed into the truck and Rick drove off before she even got settled into her seat. When he saw that she was shivering, he passed her his jacket. She snuggled into the large garment and fell asleep almost immediately. While she slept, Rick wondered why she had been out there on that part of the road and why she was heading to the shack. The shack was a strip club that was a favorite among many truck drivers because it was right on the highway, and it was only a 3-kilometer drive away from the rest stop that Rick was heading to. It wasn't a place for a nun to be at, especially at that time of the night. But Rick kept his thoughts to himself. When they got to the shack, he woke up to Nun, but instead of getting down, she faced him first. "I have a big favor to ask." I just need to pick something up and then I need a ride until we get to the next town, she said. Rick found her request suspicious and he was tempted to tell her no and continue on his journey, but he was never one who could turn down helpless people. All right, but you have to make it quick. The nun heaved a sigh of relief. She hurried into the club as quickly as she could, but she didn't come out on time. Rick was tired and hungry. He considered driving off, but he thought of how his wife would disapprove, and so he stayed. A few minutes later, the nun came out of the club, but she wasn't alone. She was with another woman who appeared to be under the influence. Behind the women were some thugs who were closely following them. Rick sensed danger, so he immediately jumped out of his truck and moved in their direction, only for the thugs to surround him and the women. "Oi, sister, leave the chick alone and we won't be forced to hurt you," one of the thugs said, but the nun said nothing and just held the woman tightly. Rick then took charge. He told the thugs off, but they didn't relent, so he was forced to pay them off with all his earnings. The thugs left them alone after that. Rick drove the women away from the shack and didn't stop until they were far away. The nun gave him directions until they arrived in front of a huge rehabilitation center. An old man was waiting outside the mansion. The nun alighted from the truck and attempted to pull out a woman by herself. Rick then came to her aid, lifting the young woman up and carrying her away from the vehicle and towards the mansion entrance. After they had safely handed the woman over to the old man, Rick tried to take his leave, but the nun stopped him. "I want to thank you for everything that you did for me tonight. There was no way I could have saved this lost soul without your help," she said before placing a small card in his hand. Rick was taken aback and elated when the nun told him, "This is the number of my lawyer. Call him as soon as he get home. He will give you the keys to a new truck for your own use if you have the need for it. Please accept this gift." Afterward, she explained how her father had left her all his estates after his death, despite the fact that she had entered the convent. She had then decided to use her wealth and influence to help women successfully undergo rehabilitation. The woman she had picked up at the strip club was living a rough life on the streets, so she wanted to turn things around by bringing her to the rehabilitation center. "This wouldn't have been possible without your help," the nun said. Rick thanked her profusely and walked back to his truck. He had just started the engine when the nun came running towards him holding something. It was his jacket. He collected the jacket from her and drove off. It wasn't until he had almost gotten home that he dipped his hands into the pocket of the jacket to bring out some pills he had been prescribed while at the hospital. But instead of the bottle of pills, Rick felt something hard. When he brought it out, it was a big wad of cash along with the card. The card read, "The world needs more men like you." When he counted it, the money was more than enough to fend for his family until his next trip. Rick went home with the money happier than he had been in a while. If you were Rick, would you have helped this nun out? Would you still call the lawyer and accept the new truck after you realized that the nun gave you the money? Thank you for watching this video. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.